Welcome to another story from a hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. This one is Cochrane's Stone Man. Hello there. We've told you once about the stone man that appeared in Hoquiam and caused quite a commotion in the archaeological circles of the Pacific Northwest, and the story behind the stone man. But perhaps you don't recall or never knew that Aberdeen had a stone man too. But as in so many of those early day happenings, Aberdeen was not to be outdone, and that community of the sawdust streets and wooden buildings back before the big fire had a stone man and a story all its own. The big idea did not originate locally, in fact. I strongly suspect that the stone man angle was one that was pretty generally worked by promoters in the early West, and that most small towns had at least one of the phenomenon that proved to be both lucrative and eventually humorous, and that have been recorded in the histories of small towns of the Old West. Anyhow, Aberdeen's was a newsmaker, and to this day, it's good for a chuckle or two. So when George has taken the customary few seconds for a word from our sponsor, we'll open the scrapbook to a story of Bob Cochrane and the Stone Man. All right, George, it's your turn first for a word from our sponsor. One of the first institutions of any importance to spring up in early Aberdeen, after Sam Ben laid out the streets and wooden buildings began to mushroom, was a drugstore opened by John R. Evans and Walter W. Sargent. It was located in the first block on Heron Street from the river, on the south side of the street, and it was doing a land office business in patented elixirs and soothing salves in the early 1890s. Walter Sargent did not live long after the venture was started, but John Evans gave his name to the drugstore, and under his management and that of his son, it was a business and a landmark on Heron Street for nearly 40 years. Now, after Sargent died, John Evans hired a young fellow named Robert S. Cochrane to clerk in the drug emporium. Bob Cochrane was an amateur pill roller and could prescribe for modest ailments or recommend the fragrances from the perfume counter or the insect powder from the shelves to chase away the fleas that infested every corner of this sawdust hamlet. Bob was also a master of ceremonies at late evening bull sessions that inevitably formed at the drugstore, as he was a young fellow of ready wit and a one-man clearinghouse for the activities of traveling men who called into town. If they wanted any news on fellow travelers or the trends of the cities, they sought out Bob. It was about 1902 that Bob made the acquaintance of a fellow who came to the harbor from Tacoma with a promotional gleam in his eye. And when the two had exchanged pleasantries and gotten to know each other more than casually, the Tacoma man propounded a scheme that he had been carrying apparently for some time. He outlined his idea in detail, emphasizing the cash value of the venture, and finally convinced Bob that he should be a shareholder in the deal. Of course, the idea was the old stone man gag. The two of them would make a plaster cast of a man, then cast the man into concrete, arrange it to be found conveniently in some isolated spot, and bring it to town for an exhibit. Tickets would be sold for the exhibit, and the two would split the proceeds. Bob thought it would be both funny and profitable. It was never revealed where the laboratory was in which Bob Cochrane laid out his plaster of Paris portrait, but most folks in later years figured out it was the back room of the old Evans drugstore. Anyhow, that was one of the first phases of the project. The Tacoma man sketched Bob out on the table, and poured plaster around him to make a life-size cast. Then the cast was stripped off and prepared for its concrete casting. Working quietly and mysteriously, the two men hauled yellow sand from Think of Me Hill and mixed it with the cement to make up the figure. They poured it in secret, and when the figure was complete, they smuggled it out of town and took it up to the Wishkal River and dropped it into the mud just above the spot where Aberdeen Stewart Field touches the riverbank now. It was arranged in a very convincing manner, and left there for a few days to acquire the Wishkal River scum and take on a very convincing appearance before the Tacoma man with a couple of townsfolk happened to stumble across it while rowing upstream. They pulled it out, the local residents wide-eyed with wonder, and brought it into the boat down Heron Street to the boat landing, and after it had been cleaned up from its Wishkal River mud, it was put on display with an admission charge of 25 cents for anyone who wanted to see the Stone Man of Aberdeen. Now, the news of the find traveled. The promoters had arranged that, and hardly had the figure gone on display than the townsfolk made a line for Heron Street to ogle at the prehistoric man who had roamed Aberdeen an estimated 10,000 years before Sam Ben. Women were informed that they could not view the archaeological find, but men could come in for a quarter. They all packed into the little tent and examined the figure and left wondering whether they had been taken for 25 cents or had actually seen a petrified figure of a Grays Harbor aborigine. John Carney, the publisher of the Aberdeen Herald, took a free look at the as a member of the press, and was convinced that he had seen one of the great wonders of time. His editorial on the discovery advised all who had a true interest in their community to go down to Heron Street and see the phenomenon. Now, Paul Smits, the town's leading medic and surgeon, was somewhat a man of science in his own right. He had an inquiring mind and was known for his keen interest in all natural marvels, and he was among the first to put down a quarter to take in the showing of the stone figure. The doc walked around it carefully and noted its characteristics and thought it was very convincing. But still, there was something about it that made him look at it a little closer, and he was certain that he never knew anyone old enough to have been petrified. He walked around and around the figure, thumped it, felt it, and when no one was looking, he dug a small hole in on the stone creature's backside with his pocket knife. Instead of tough glassy substance of silica and calcium that he had expected to find, he found, of course, yellow sand in the epidermis of the exhibit. The doc said nothing, but folded his knife in a hurry and back to the hospital to take care of his patients. Now, the showing of the Stone Man continued for several days. In fact, it was packing them in. The promoters were doing quite well with their venture. The Tacoma man handled the collection and administration and displayed the petrified wonder, while Bob Cochran kept up his constant sales talk from the drugstore down the block, describing the authenticity of the Stone Man, and why every resident in Grays Harbor could well spend a quarter to view this wonder. And of course, Bob came in for his cut of the promotion. And then came a Saturday night, and the bistros of Aberdeen waterfront roared with the wilderness of frontier town unbending. From the ships in port and the logging camps close enough to send their men to town, from the mills and the shipyards came the horny-handed, hard-working, hard-fighting, hard-drinking workmen. With their bellies full of grog, they rolled from bar to bar, and more than one patted down a 2-bit piece to see the Stone Man and remarked on the characteristics of the monolithic being. And about that time, a quartet of caulkers from the Lindstrom shipyard, out to tear up the town, pulled up before the exhibit hall and took a course of tickets to the table. They plunked down their money and staggered in to see the wonder as they had heard about it. Now caulkers, especially John Lindstrom caulkers, were hard-playing fun makers. A pair was enough to turn a saloon upside down if they ran amok, but 4 of them was enough to wreak Heron Street if they got loose. And they were not satisfied just to see the Stone Man. They had to feel it. They had to thump it, shouting the while and punctuating their experiments with ribald laughter. And finally, one of them undertook to set the archaeological discovery up. Maybe he intended to dance with it. Such were the pranks of the caulkers on the tear. Anyhow, he dropped the petrified man, and a sandy concrete leg broke off. Now caulkers are not scientific men, but one glance at the yellow sand would have proven it was a phony, and while taking their glances and getting out of the place to escape repercussions for their damage, the place was in an instant confusion, and also the jig was up with the exhibitors. Shouts of fraud went up, and the promoters fled with their proceeds. The exhibit closed promptly, and the town had part of its answer. Doc Smith laughed and announced that he had known it all along. But as he put it, it wasn't my Stone Man, and I didn't want to spoil the fun. The promoters left town, and the Stone Man was thrown into the tide flats behind the Heron Street building, where he probably rests today, and is a valuable addition to this, our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.